Senator Scott, you're out of line. Ilhan Omar's voice echoed through the packed committee room as she realized what was happening. But it was too late. The immigration attorney sitting behind Tim Scott had already confirmed the authenticity of the documents. In the next 90 seconds, America would learn the truth about one of its most controversial congresswomen. What started as a routine Senate Finance Committee hearing on immigration policy was about to become the most explosive political confrontation of the decade. Two of America's most prominent political figures, one a black Republican senator from South Carolina, the other a Somali-American Democratic congresswoman from Minnesota, were about to engage in a battle that would reshape how Americans think about immigration, identity, and political truth. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these explosive political moments that are defining modern American politics. Trust me, what you're about to witness will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about political narratives in Washington. The date was March 15th, 2025. The Senate Finance Committee was conducting its quarterly review of immigration services and border security funding. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, the kind of dry policy discussion that usually attracted little media attention and even less public interest. But someone had made a critical error in scheduling. They had invited both Tim Scott, the senior Republican senator from South Carolina and the party's rising star on immigration issues, and Ilhan Omar, the firebrand progressive congresswoman who had become the face of immigrant advocacy in America. These two had been on a collision course for months. Scott, the son of a single mother who had worked her way out of poverty, represented a very different vision of the American dream than Omar, whose family had fled civil war in Somalia when she was a child. Their philosophical differences ran deep, but what was about to unfold went far beyond political ideology. Tim Scott, at 59, had become one of the most respected voices in the Republican Party. As the only black Republican in the Senate, he occupied a unique position in American politics. His personal story of growing up in poverty in North Charleston, raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs, resonated with voters across racial and economic lines. Scott's rise to prominence hadn't been easy. He'd faced skepticism from both sides of the political aisle. Some Republicans questioned his conservative credentials, while many Democrats viewed him as a token minority figure designed to provide cover for Republican policies they considered harmful to black communities. But Scott had proven himself through years of principled conservatism and effective legislation. His work on tax reform, criminal justice issues, and economic opportunity zones had earned him respect even from political opponents. He was known for his measured tone, his deep knowledge of policy details, and his ability to work across party lines when necessary. What many people didn't know about Tim Scott was his deep personal interest in immigration issues. His own family's history included stories of migration and struggle that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to seek opportunity in America. His great-grandfather had migrated from rural South Carolina to Charleston in search of work. His grandfather had moved the family north during the Great Migration, before eventually returning to South Carolina. These experiences had given Scott a nuanced view of immigration that sometimes put him at odds with the more hardline elements of his own party. He believed strongly in legal immigration and the American dream, but he also believed that the immigration system needed to be fair, orderly, and based on truth. Ilhan Omar, at 43, represented a very different path to American political prominence. Born in Mogadishu, Somalia, she had fled with her family to a refugee camp in Kenya when she was 8 years old. 4 years later, her family was granted asylum in the United States, eventually settling in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Omar's story had become central to her political identity. She often spoke about the challenges her family faced as refugees, the discrimination they encountered, and the opportunities America had provided. Her journey from refugee camp to the halls of Congress was indeed remarkable and had inspired countless immigrants and refugees across the country. She had first gained national attention as a state legislator in Minnesota, where her progressive positions on health care, education, and social justice had made her a favorite among young activists. Her election to Congress in 2018 had been seen as a watershed moment for representation of immigrants and Muslims in American politics. Omar's congressional career had been marked by both significant achievements and considerable controversy. She had been a vocal advocate for immigrant rights, a critic of American foreign policy in the Middle East, and a champion of progressive economic policies. But she had also faced criticism for some of her statements about Israel, American foreign policy, and her own personal history. The controversies had never seriously threatened her political position. Her district in Minneapolis was solidly Democratic, and her base of progressive supporters remained loyal. But they had made her a lightning rod for conservative criticism and a frequent target of right-wing media attention. What brought Scott and Omar together on that March morning was supposed to be a discussion about funding for immigration courts and border security measures. The hearing had been scheduled months in advance, with both politicians invited to provide perspectives on how immigration policy affected their respective constituencies. But Tim Scott had come to the hearing with something more than policy positions. Hidden in his briefcase was a collection of documents that would challenge the very foundation of Omar's political narrative. The hearing began normally enough. Committee Chairman Senator Robert Hayes of Iowa opened with routine remarks about the importance of immigration policy and the need for bipartisan solutions. The other committee members made their standard opening statements, touching on various aspects of border security, legal immigration processes, and refugee resettlement. When it was Tim Scott's turn to speak, he began with his typical measured tone. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by acknowledging the complexity of immigration issues and the human stories behind every policy decision we make here." He spoke about his own family's history of migration within the United States, drawing parallels between internal migration during the Great Migration and international immigration today. His remarks were thoughtful and non-controversial, the kind of speech that might earn polite applause but would quickly be forgotten. Ilhan Omar, when her turn came, delivered a passionate defense of refugee rights and immigrant communities. She spoke about her own family's experience, the challenges they faced, and the gratitude they felt for the opportunities America had provided. "My family came to this country with nothing but hope," she said, her voice carrying the emotion that had made her such an effective advocate. "We were fleeing violence, seeking safety, and looking for the chance to build a better life." That's the story of millions of Americans, whether their families came here a generation ago or many generations ago. Her remarks drew nods of approval from the Democratic members of the committee and scattered applause from the gallery. It was the kind of speech that had made her a powerful voice for immigrant rights. But then something shifted in the room's dynamic. Congresswoman Omar, Tim Scott said, his voice taking on a different tone, "I appreciate your personal story, and I think it's important that we have this discussion. But I wonder if you could help the committee understand some discrepancies that have come to light regarding your family's immigration timeline." Omar's expression flickered with confusion, then concern. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Senator Scott." Scott reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "I have here copies of documents from the State Department, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Would you like me to share what these documents reveal about your family's actual immigration history?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Omar's supporters in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, while Republican committee members leaned forward with interest. "Senator Scott," Omar said, her voice rising, "I don't know what you think you have there, but my family's story is well documented and has been public knowledge since I first ran for office." "Actually, Congresswoman, that's where things get interesting." Scott opened the folder and pulled out the first document. "This is a State Department cable from 1995 detailing your family's initial asylum application. According to this document, your family didn't flee Somalia in 1991 as you've consistently stated. In fact, your family left Somalia in 1993 and they didn't go to a refugee camp in Kenya." The room fell silent. Omar's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure. "Senator, I don't know where you got those documents, but there must be some mistake." "I thought you might say that," Scott replied calmly. "That's why I asked Ms. Jennifer Martinez, a former immigration attorney with the State Department, to review these documents for authenticity. Ms. Martinez, would you please stand? A woman in her 50s rose from her seat behind Scott. Senator, I've reviewed the documents you provided. They are authentic State Department records, properly classified and declassified through appropriate channels. Omar realized the gravity of the situation. Senator Scott, you're out of line. But Scott continued, his voice steady and professional. Congresswoman, according to these documents, your family actually lived in Kenya for several years before applying for refugee status. They weren't in a refugee camp. They were living in Nairobi, where your father worked for the Kenyan government's refugee assistance program. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Omar's carefully constructed narrative of fleeing directly from war-torn Somalia to a refugee camp was being systematically dismantled with official government documents. Furthermore, Scott continued, these records show that your family's asylum application was initially denied because investigators questioned whether your family faced genuine persecution in Somalia. The application was only approved after your family hired an immigration attorney and submitted additional documentation. Omar tried to interrupt, but Scott held up his hand. I'm not finished, Congresswoman. The most troubling part of these records concerns your family's background in Somalia. According to State Department intelligence reports, your father wasn't a victim of the civil war. He was a mid-level official in the sidebar regime that many Somalis were actually fleeing from. The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. Omar's supporters looked stunned, while conservative observers seemed vindicated. This wasn't just a discrepancy in dates. This was a fundamental challenge to the moral foundation of Omar's political identity. That's not true, Omar shouted, her composure finally cracking. My family were victims, not perpetrators. We fled violence, just like thousands of other Somali families. Actually, Scott said, pulling out another document, this UN refugee assessment from 1994 tells a different story. It notes that your family was among several groups of former Bar regime officials who were seeking resettlement, not because they faced persecution, but because they had lost their positions when the government fell. The implications were staggering. If Scott's documents were accurate, Omar hadn't fled persecution. She had fled the consequences of her family's association with a dictatorial regime that had oppressed the very people she now claimed to represent. Congresswoman, Scott continued, I'm not questioning your right to be here or your contributions to American society, but I'm questioning whether the story you've told about your family's immigration is accurate. And if it's not accurate, I think the American people deserve to know the truth. Omar was visibly shaken. The confident, articulate advocate who had entered the hearing room was gone, replaced by someone who looked cornered and desperate. Senator Scott, she said, her voice trembling with anger, even if your documents are accurate, and I'm not saying they are, they don't change the fact that my family came to America seeking a better life. They don't change the struggles we faced or the discrimination we encountered. But they do change the nature of those struggles, don't they? Scott replied, there's a difference between fleeing persecution and fleeing the consequences of political association. There's a difference between being a victim and being something else. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation. Omar realized that her entire political narrative was crumbling in real time on live television in front of the American people. Committee Chairman Hayes attempted to restore order. I think we should take a brief recess to allow. No, Omar interrupted, standing up abruptly. I won't let Senator Scott's character assassination continue without a response. What happened next would become one of the most viral political moments in American history. Omar looked directly into the C-SPAN cameras, her eyes blazing with defiance. Senator Scott and his Republican colleagues think they can destroy me with selective documents and character assassination. But let me tell you something about my family story. She paused, taking a deep breath that seemed to steady her resolve. Yes, my father worked for the Somali government. Yes, our departure from Somalia was more complicated than a simple narrative of fleeing violence. But that doesn't change the fundamental truth of our experience as immigrants in America. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. When my family arrived in America, we were poor. We were Muslim. We were black. We faced discrimination and challenges that Senator Scott for all his talk about poverty and struggle, has never had to confront as a refugee family. The room was riveted. This wasn't the typical political pivot or deflection. This was a raw, emotional response from someone whose entire identity was under attack. Senator Scott wants to make this about documents and timelines, Omar continued. But I want to make this about something more important, about who gets to tell their story in America and who gets to challenge those stories. She turned to face Scott directly. You've spent this entire hearing trying to undermine my credibility, my family's story, and my right to represent the people who elected me. But let me ask you this, Senator. What gives you the right to be the arbiter of immigrant authenticity? Scott opened his mouth to respond, but Omar wasn't finished. You talk about truth and accuracy, but where was your concern for truth when Republican leaders were spreading lies about Barack Obama's birthplace? Where was your demand for documentation when Donald Trump was making false claims about Mexican immigrants? Where was your commitment to accuracy when your own party was demonizing refugees and asylum seekers? The attack was fierce and personal, and it hit Scott visibly. His calm demeanor flickered for the first time during the hearing. The truth is, Omar continued, her voice rising to its peak intensity, you don't care about immigration policy or refugee experiences. You care about finding ways to attack the few Muslims, the few immigrants, the few women of color who have managed to gain political power in this country. She gestured toward the gallery, where her supporters were beginning to rally. But here's what you don't understand, Senator Scott. My story, our story, isn't just about the specific details of how we came to America. It's about what we've built here. It's about the communities we've served, the policies we've fought for, the people we've lifted up. Omar's voice took on the cadence and passion that had made her such an effective speaker. You can challenge the timeline of my family's immigration. You can question the circumstances of our departure from Somalia. You can try to use bureaucratic documents to undermine our experience. But you cannot erase what we've accomplished in America. She pointed directly at Scott. And you certainly cannot use your position as a black Republican senator to give legitimacy to the same anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim rhetoric that your party has been pushing for years. The room erupted. Republicans were shouting about procedure and decorum. Democrats were applauding Omar's passionate response. The gallery was in chaos as supporters and critics reacted to what had become a deeply personal confrontation. But Omar wasn't done. As the noise died down, she delivered her final blow. Senator Scott, you want to talk about truth? Here's the truth. My family may have had connections to the previous Somali government. Our departure may have been motivated by political considerations as much as safety concerns. But when we arrived in America, we were still refugees. We were still displaced. We were still starting over with nothing. Her voice dropped to a more intimate tone that somehow carried through the large room. And unlike some people in this room, we didn't spend our time in America trying to tear down other immigrants or question other people's right to be here. We spent our time building communities, fighting for justice, and working to make America live up to its promises. She gathered her papers and prepared to leave. Senator Scott, you may have won this round with your documents and your gotcha moment, but you've lost something more important. You've lost the moral authority to speak about immigration, about refugees, and about what it means to be American. As Omar walked toward the exit, she turned back one final time. The American people will decide whether they care more about the perfect details of an immigration story or about the work that immigrants do once they're here. I'm confident they'll make the right choice. With that, she left the hearing room, followed by a crowd of supporters and reporters. The committee was left in stunned silence, unsure how to proceed after what had become the most dramatic political confrontation many of them had ever witnessed. Tim Scott sat at his table, the manila folder still open in front of him. He had accomplished what he set out to do. He had challenged Omar's narrative with documented evidence. But Omar's response had transformed the confrontation from a simple fact-checking exercise into something much more complex and emotionally charged. In the immediate aftermath of the hearing, social media exploded. Video clips of both Scott's presentation of the documents and Omar's passionate response were shared millions of times within hours. The hashtags #OmarTruth and #ScottDocuments both began trending as supporters of both politicians rallied to their respective sides. Conservative media outlets declared victory, arguing that Scott had exposed fundamental dishonesty in Omar's background that called into question her fitness for office. "Tim Scott destroys Ilhan Omar's lies" became a common headline across right-wing news sites and social media accounts. Liberal commentators, meanwhile, praised Omar's response as a powerful pushback against what they characterized as a racist and Islamophobic attack. Ilhan Omar schools Tim Scott on immigrant dignity was the counter-narrative that emerged from progressive media outlets. But the real story was more complex than either partisan response suggested. Scott had indeed presented what appeared to be authentic documentation that contradicted Omar's public narrative about her family's immigration. The discrepancies were significant and raised legitimate questions about the accuracy of her story. At the same time, Omar's response had effectively shifted the conversation from the specific details of her family's immigration to broader questions about immigrant rights, political authenticity, and the motivations behind attacks on minority politicians. Legal experts who reviewed the documents Scott had presented generally agreed that they appeared authentic and raised serious questions about Omar's narrative. Immigration attorney David Chun, who had no political affiliation with either party, told CNN, "If these documents are accurate, they suggest a significantly different story than the one Representative Omar has told publicly. That doesn't necessarily mean anything illegal occurred, but it does suggest that the public narrative was incomplete or inaccurate." Political scientists were divided on the implications. Professor Sarah Williams of Georgetown University argued that the specific details of Omar's immigration story are less important than her record of service and advocacy. But Professor Michael Torres of the University of Texas countered that political authenticity matters, especially when a politician's personal story is central to their political identity. The FBI announced that it would review the documents Scott had presented to determine whether any laws had been violated in the immigration process. The House Ethics Committee indicated that it might also examine whether Omar had made any false statements in official proceedings. But perhaps most significantly, the confrontation had exposed deep fractures within American politics about immigration, identity, and truth. The passionate responses on both sides revealed how personal and emotional these issues had become for many Americans. Omar's supporters argued that the attack on her story was part of a broader pattern of questioning the legitimacy of immigrants and people of color in American politics. They pointed to similar challenges to Barack Obama's birthplace, questions about Kamala Harris's citizenship, and attacks on other minority politicians as evidence of a systematic effort to undermine diverse voices in government. Scott's supporters countered that accuracy and honesty in public narratives were essential to democratic governance, regardless of the politician's race, religion, or background. They argued that holding all politicians accountable for the truth of their statements was a fundamental responsibility of the press and political opposition. The controversy continued to evolve in the days and weeks following the hearing. New documents emerged that provided additional context to Omar's family's immigration, some supporting Scott's narrative and others providing more nuance to the story. Investigative journalists began digging deeper into the backgrounds of both politicians, examining their own narratives for potential discrepancies. The scrutiny revealed that political storytelling, even by well-intentioned politicians, often involved simplification and selective emphasis that could be misleading if examined too closely. 6 months later, the confrontation was still being analyzed and debated. Omar had survived the immediate political fallout. Her core supporters remained loyal, and she was re-elected to Congress with a comfortable margin. But the questions raised about her story continued to follow her, and she became more cautious about the details she shared regarding her family's immigration. Tim Scott, meanwhile, had established himself as a formidable political force willing to challenge opponents with hard evidence and tough questions. His careful, document-based approach to the confrontation had impressed many observers, even those who disagreed with his politics. The hearing also led to broader changes in how immigration stories were covered and discussed in American politics. News organizations began doing more rigorous fact-checking of politicians' personal narratives, and immigration advocates became more careful about the details they emphasized in their storytelling. Perhaps most importantly, the confrontation forced a more nuanced conversation about immigration in America. The simple narratives of victim and persecutor, refugee and citizen were replaced by more complex discussions about the variety of experiences that bring people to America and the different motivations that drive immigration. The 90 seconds that changed everything had revealed fundamental tensions in American politics about truth, identity, and belonging. Tim Scott and Ilhan Omar had both emerged from the confrontation as more complex figures than they had been before. Scott is someone willing to challenge popular narratives with uncomfortable facts. Omar is someone willing to defend her community even when the facts were complicated. In the end, the hearing had accomplished something neither politician had intended. It had forced Americans to grapple with the complexity of immigration stories and the difficulty of reducing human experiences to simple political narratives. The manila folder that Tim Scott had brought to the hearing eventually made its way to the National Archives, where it joined other documents that had shaped American political discourse. The 90 seconds of confrontation had become part of the historical record, a moment when two Americans from very different backgrounds had clashed over fundamental questions of truth, identity, and belonging. Years later, both Scott and Omar would reflect on the hearing as a turning point in their careers and in American politics more broadly. Neither would claim complete victory, but both would acknowledge that the confrontation had forced important conversations about immigration, authenticity, and political truth that the country had needed to have. The lasting lesson of their confrontation was that in American democracy, the truth is often more complex than any single narrative can capture, and that the most important political moments often occur when that complexity is finally acknowledged and examined. If this incredible story of political confrontation and truth-telling inspired you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with everyone who needs to understand how complex immigration narratives really are in American politics. Let us know in the comments what you think about Tim Scott's approach and Ilhan Omar's response. And don't forget to check out our other videos about the political moments that are reshaping America's understanding of itself. The message was clear. In American politics, the truth is never simple, but it's always worth pursuing, no matter how uncomfortable the questions or how complex the answers might be.